All right, so we begin Unit 5. Unit 5 is disease and the protection against diseases. So the definition by Cambridge is an abnormal condition affecting an organism which reduces the effectiveness of its function, an absence of one or more of physical, social, and mental well-being. That is a very broad definition. So, an infectious disease, the invasion of an organism's body tissue by disease-causing agents, their multiplication, and the reaction of the host tissues to these organisms and the toxins they produce. Infectious disease, also known as transmissible disease or communicable disease, is the illness resulting from an infection. So some examples of diseases and their causative agent. Smallpox is caused by a virus. The causative agent of smallpox, the disease, is a virus. Vibrio cholerae. Vibrio cholerae, there should be an E there, is a bacterial pathogen that causes cholera. Tinea pedis is athlete's foot, and it is caused by a fungal infection. So the greatest killer of mankind is actually an infectious disease caused by a parasite. Malaria. Malaria is the common name of the disease caused by Plasmodium genus species, Vivax, Falciparum, Ovale, Malariae as well. They are many species. There's 5 species of Plasmodium that cause malaria. But it is a parasitic infection by protoctists, as Cambridge calls them. Protoctists or protoctistas. Be sure that you spell it correctly because spelling counts. Protoctistes. Or replace the S with an A if you're referring to the kingdom or general group. So essentially, protoctists, or we call them here protists, they're a kingdom or large grouping that is either synonymous with protista or equivalent to the protista, together with their multicellular descendants. So a non-infectious disease or a non-communicable disease is a medical condition or disease that is non-infectious or non-transmissible. This does not mean they do not have a causative agent. You can have a non-infectious disease that has a causative agent. You can also have a specific timing. An infectious disease can also have acute or chronic timing. Acute and chronic timing has nothing to do specifically with non-infectious disease. But you can have acute or chronic timing. The non-infectious disease, what defines non-infectious disease, is that it is not transmissible. It is not caused by an infectious causative agent, a pathogen. So, timing-wise, chronic diseases last for longer periods of time and progress slowly, whereas acute diseases may progress very quickly and cause significant morbidity and mortality. Morbidity is a disease state. Mortality is death. So some examples, causative agents and timing. Lung cancer is a genetic or is a non-infectious disease that has genetic causative, that has a genetic cause, but it can also have a smoking causative agent, cigarette smoke. The timing is dependent. There can be an acute time scale or a chronic time scale, depending on the level of malignancy of that cancer, or the level of progression, or the progression of that particular cancer. Sickle cell anemia has a genetic cause, but there is a chronic disease. It has a chronic time course, but it has acute attacks and crises. there is acute stages on a chronic time scale. So the lung cancer is not infectious because it may be caused by invasive cells, but it is not caused by an infectious biological agent. You do not get cancer from another person. Another person does not give you their cancer. You grow your own cancer if you have cancer. And I sincerely hope you don't. Lung cancer is a non-infectious disease because your own cells are the fault here. Mutations in your own cells have led to cancer. Sickle cell as well may be due to a biological cell gone bad, but it is not infectious because you cannot catch sickle cell. You cannot transmit sickle cell from yourself to another person. It is your own genetics that is causing you to have the symptoms of sickle cell anemia. So, the Cambridge asks, learners will summarize discussions in a comparison table or in comparative sentences for what makes diseases infectious or non-infectious. That is how they can test you. So, drawing this in a box grid form and describe the features, similar to how you were supposed to describe the features of DNA versus RNA. You would describe the features of an infectious versus a non-infectious disease. And once again, very much like DNA and RNA, you must describe each feature next to each other, related to each other. The feature that is an infectious disease has a biological agent that results in an immune response, whereas a non-infectious disease is a non-infectious agent that results in that does not result in such a response. They must be right next to each other in order for you to gain that point. You can't mix and match those boxes. Return to a previous video where I discussed the RNA versus DNA questions if you want to review exactly what I'm talking about with my hand waves. So let's discuss pathogens now. A pathogen comes from the Greek pathos, suffering, or disease, and genes, born. So it is suffering. It is what births suffering. And yes, pathos means suffering, not emotions, although philosophers would have you believe that all emotions are suffering. Thanks, Plato or Socrates or whoever it was. I'm sorry I'm not up on my Greek philosophers. It's been a while. But the Cambridge definition of a pathogen is a biological agent, e.g., a virus, bacterium, fungus, or protoctist. Remember, protoctist, Protoctist, that causes disease and has proteins, foreign non-self antigens, as part of its structure that are different from those of the human host. Different from those of the human host is the key. That is what makes this a pathogen. A cancer cell is a biological agent that causes disease and has proteins, but they are not foreign. They are not non-self. They are not foreign to the host. So, germs are not pathogens. Do not use germs. That is not an acceptable use. That is not an acceptable term to use. Pathogens is the only acceptable one to use. Do not use it. Well, pathogens isn't the only acceptable one. Causative agent is acceptable. That's interchangeable with pathogens when talking about an infectious disease. So another common error is to use the term disease rather than the pathogen, or to name the disease instead of the pathogen. So for example, the disease enters the cell, instead of saying, or saying malaria enters red blood cells, instead of saying Plasmodium merozoites enter the red blood cells. That is correct. Plasmodium merozoites enter the red blood cells is correct. Saying malaria enters the red blood cell is wrong, because malaria is the disease that occurs when you have Plasmodium in your system. The disease doesn't enter the cell. The disease is what is caused by all of that pathogen entering your cell. You can say the pathogen enters the cell. That's okay too. That's interchangeable too. The pathogen or the causative agent. But it's better if you are specific, because the more specific you are, the more likely you are to get that point. Spelling mistakes. Spelling counts in Cambridge. Causative agent with an A. I can't tell you how many times I spelled it with an I, and then the little red line showed up on Microsoft, because I use Microsoft. You might use any other program, because, you know, open source, why the hell not? But I can't tell you how many times that little wiggly line showed up and I was like, I did it again, and I had to go change the I to an A. Seriously, it's annoying. It's causative with an A. Spell it properly. Spelling counts, please. So we were discussing lung cancer, but let's discuss some of the other lung diseases. What sort of diseases are chronic bronchitis and emphysema? These are the two ends of the spectrum of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They are non-infectious diseases. They are non-infectious diseases because they are not caused by a biological agent that infects the host and multiplies within it with surface antigens that are different from the host, non-self antigens. It doesn't reduce an immune response. It's not an infection. So it has nothing to do with the lack of a causative agent, because there may very well be a causative agent, because smoking is actually, cigarette smoking is actually the leading cause of COPD. You don't have to smoke to get COPD, but it's certainly not helping you. And it's certainly going to hurt you. So, what does the term carcinogen mean? It is any substance, radionuclide, or radiation that is an agent directly involved in causing cancer. It may be due to the ability to damage the genome or the disruption of cellular metabolic processes. And carcinogenic is just a grammar thing, where it has the potential to cause cancer. So a carcinogen is carcinogenic by its very nature. It is something that has the potential to cause cancer. Something that has the potential to cause cancer is carcinogenic. It is a carcinogen. Just know your grammar. So, with reference to genetic mutation, though, and remember, genetic mutation is not the only way that carcinogens can work. Carcinogens can also work by removing the non-precancerous cells. You can kill off all the cells that don't have precancerous mutations, and that's how a carcinogen could work. But they may cause mutations, and that's how many carcinogens may work. So, with reference to genetic mutation, if you promote the genetic mutation of two particular types of genes, proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes, those are important cancer genes. Proto-oncogenes are working genes. They are working genes. When they mutate into oncogenes, you take away the proto. They are no longer proto. They are no longer prototype They are no longer proto, they are oncogenes. They are associated with the development of cancer. So you mutate something that was working just fine, and then it becomes cancer promoting when it mutates. When it mutates, it promotes cancer. A tumor suppressor gene is normally working just fine, controlling the cell cycle, keeping everything from growing out of control. When you mutate a tumor suppressor gene, it stops working and the cell cycle becomes uncontrolled. And you have division without control, and you have many, many divisions, and it becomes easier to develop more and more mutations. So those are two ways that genes can cease to function and cause cancer. So this one mutates and works over time and becomes problematic. This one is preventing problems, and you remove its working, and it stopped preventing problems, and those problems become more numerous. So if you remember the hallmarks of cancer from Unit 3, these are effectively the same idea as you put a brick on the gas pedal and you cut the brake line. Same ideas. Slightly different mechanism, but same ideas. Mutagen versus carcinogen. Not all mutagens are carcinogens, and not all carcinogens are mutagens, but they are a Venn diagram with a hefty amount of overlap. A mutagen is an agent that increases the mutation rate of DNA. Exposure to a mutagen will cause more mutations at a faster rate. It does not mean that a mutagen is a carcinogen. It does not preclude the idea. It does not mean that that a mutagen cannot be a carcinogen. It certainly can be. But it's not always. A carcinogen is an agent that can cause cancer. So mutagens don't always cause cancer, because if the mutation they promote doesn't end up causing cancer, it's a single point mutation in an intron region that leads to nothing in particular happening, then it's a silent mutation. That mutagen didn't cause cancer. Sometimes mutagens do nothing. A carcinogen has the potential to cause cancer, but a carcinogen may cause cancer through not mutation. Not through mutation. A carcinogen may cause cancer by removing cells without a mutation. So let's say that you have 5 cells, and one of those cells has a mutation that allows it to survive a poison. That poison is a carcinogen because that mutation is a precancerous mutation. If that mutation is not precancerous, that poison is no longer a carcinogen then. So this precancerous mutation allows it to survive this poison. You take that poison and you kill the other 4 cells, and only the one cell remains. And only the one cell remains that had that mutation that is precancerous. Now that cell regrows and fills the space that formerly housed the other 4 cells. And now the entire area is full of that cell with the precancerous lesion, and one with the precancerous mutation. And one mutation can eventually lead to another, and they'll stack up, and that will eventually lead to cancer. So a carcinogen that did not cause a mutation in and of itself can lead to cancer by vertical selection pressure. By selection pressure. So, keep the term mutagen and carcinogen distinct in your minds. Never use mutagen when you mean carcinogen. Never use carcinogen when you mean mutagen. If you mean one, do not use the other. Only ever say what you mean. So here are some example carcinogens. Yeah, it's a big list. Here's some probable carcinogens. Yeah, it too is a big list. We're not going to go into detail. You don't need to know these one for one. But suffice it to say that pretty much you can't get through a day without coming across something that's probably going to give you cancer. Everything you come across in the world today, the process of making it, or the process of consuming it, or some process involved in it, has some carcinogen involved. Heck, if you went out and saw the sun today, UV light. So, let's talk about lung cancer now, because that one, we have a really big carcinogen to blame. So, you can get lung cancer. You can develop lung cancer without ever smoking. In fact, 18% of lung cancer patients, and don't ask me what year this is from because I don't remember where I got it, sorry. A percentage of patients with lung cancer never smoked, have no tobacco exposure. So it's possible to spontaneously develop lung cancer. And it's a case of bad circumstances. 21% in this same diagram here are current smokers. And 61% in this diagram are former smokers. You don't even have to have kept on smoking. The damage is already done for you to develop lung cancer after exposure to cigarette smoke. Don't smoke. But it's not the only carcinogen involved, but it's the biggest one. Of the lung cancer causes that we can identify, a known carcinogen, 90% of lung cancer cases that are due to a carcinogen exposure are smoking. The other 10% are split between 4% asbestos and 6% other. Other. Everything else. So, smoking, number 1 carcinogen. Asbestos, number 2. A big lead for smoking and a trailing asbestos. And then everything else is number 3. Asbestos has a big lead on everything else because it comprises 4% and everything else shares the other 6. And smoking doesn't just give you lung cancer. Smoking can also cause many other types of cancer. Nearly every other organ system can develop cancer from smoking. The lung is just primarily 78%. 78% of these 159 or 159.6 thousand individual cases with rounding. 78% from smoking were lung cancer cases. So yes, primarily lung cancer, because where is the smoke going? Into your lungs. But we also have larynx, because, well, where does the smoke go? From your mouth, to your larynx, to your trachea, to your lungs. And while we're talking about the mouth, 3%, larynx 2%. Esophagus is right next door, 5%, Because what is that doing to the inside of your mouth? It's coating your saliva. And what do you do to your saliva? You swallow. Going down. Where does the esophagus go? Where does the esophagus go? Into your stomach. 2% stomach cancer. Where does that lead? To your gut tube. Everywhere else in your body. So your entire body, and besides that, the rest of the carcinogens are going to be absorbed throughout your body as well, through various means. So you're going to have 4% increase, 4% of pancreatic cancers are related to smoking, 2% of kidney cancers, 1% of leukemias, 1% leukemias, and 1% cervical cancers. Gentlemen are saved from the cervical cancer one. 1% of the bullets being shot at you. Yeah. Don't smoke. However, it is not precise to say that cigarettes cause cancer. We have to instead say there is a correlation between tobacco smoking and the development of lung cancer. And tar in tobacco smoke is known to be a cause of lung cancer. The reason why it's not precise to say that is because a cigarette that's still in a pack, unsmoked, far away from you, is not going to cause you cancer. That's why. If you don't light it, you're not going to get cancer from it. So that's why it's not precise to say cigarettes cause cancer. There is a correlation between tobacco smoking and the development of cancer. If you don't smoke them, you won't get cancer from them. Don't smoke them. The tar in the tobacco smoke is the #1 carcinogen for Cambridge's purposes. Is known to be a cause of lung cancer. Don't smoke the cigarettes. So, here are some of the additives in cigarettes, some of the negative things that are in cigarette smoke. I have put a red box around carbon monoxide and nicotine because we're about to discuss them very soon. And I put a star next to tar because that's the primary causative agent of lung cancer. It is a frequently asked question on the Cambridge exam. What is the primary causative agent associated with cigarette smoking for lung cancer? It's the tar. Because the tar is in the highest percent, the tar is in the highest concentrations in the smoke, and it is the one with the highest correlation. Now there's other stuff. And by the way, there's also lead in cigarette smoke. That one is not on this list, but I found a picture of this in French that says plomb, which is lead in French. Yeah. There's also lead. I chose not to use the French one because I've done enough translating from French. So you also have copper. That's right. The stuff they coat pennies with, because pennies are not pure copper, and which they should be abolished anyway. We should get rid of the penny, and I don't care that this is on YouTube now. Get rid of the penny. Abolish the penny, please. Write your congressperson. All right. Tar, nicotine, acetone, nail polish remover, paint stripper, ammonia, you know, the stuff that makes your pee smell, the chemical cleaning agent, that stuff. Arsenic, the poison. Benzene, which is in, well, it says petrol fumes, but you don't call it petrol in the United States. We call it gasoline. It's also used as a chemical preservative in a lot of chemical processes and what's the word I'm looking for? Industrial chemicals and industrial solvents. It's an industrial solvent. Butane, lighter fluid. Butane is lighter fluid. Formaldehyde is embalming fluid. Hydrogen cyanide, you know, the poison. Yeah. It's the poison gas form, not the kind that the secret agents, they break between the teeth and then they throw them at the mouth. That's TB. Hydrogen cyanide gas is, and then they die. Methanol is rocket fuel or wood alcohol. It can make you go blind and crazy. Yeah. Methane, swamp gas, also us farts. Yeah, farts from us. It's also a greenhouse gas, by the way. 4 times more potent as four times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, by the way. Toluene is an industrial solvent, also used as a paint thinner. DDT, a banned insecticide. Yes. The stuff that make the eagle shells super thin and, because it went all the way up through the fish. Radon, which is a radioactive gas. It's you find it in basements, which we don't have down here in Florida, but basements, generally if you have high levels of radon, they might condemn your house, actually, if it's like really high. And that's also, by the way, a carcinogen that is associated with lung cancer. And various other cancers, especially, I think, lymphoma. I'm pretty sure lymphoma. And polonium, radioactive fallout. So yes. Oops. Come on. There we go. Don't smoke. Please don't smoke. So, cigarettes are bad. The red outlines around carbon monoxide and nicotine. It's time to discuss them. Both of those compounds can freely diffuse through alveolar walls and into the bloodstream easily. Through alveolar and endothelial walls. Now I say alveolar walls and endothelial walls. I don't say cell walls. I say the walls because I'm referring to both the plasma membrane on the alveolar surface and the interstitial surface, and the endothelial interstitial plasma membrane surface, and the lumen plasma membrane surface. It goes through 4 membranes, 4 plasma membranes, before it gets into the bloodstream. But it freely diffuses. They are both small enough molecules to freely diffuse across those plasma membranes. And they result in direct cardiovascular damage. And when I say the word cardiovascular, I mean cardio referring to the heart, vascular referring to the vessels. When you add those words together, it's the heart and vessels. So let's talk about the acute effects of carbon monoxide. In sufficiently high concentrations of carbon monoxide, you die, straight up. 0.1% concentration of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere kills you by asphyxiation. We've already discussed that when we were discussing yesterday the gas exchange in the lungs. And we've also already discussed that hemoglobin has a 250 times greater affinity for carbon monoxide than oxygen. And that carbon monoxide will displace oxygen from hemoglobin, if it can. We also know, because of that image, that cigarette smoke contains carbon monoxide. And because people aren't dying from smoking a single cigarette, we know that the cigarette smoke contains less than 0.1% concentration of carbon monoxide. We can infer this. However, cigarette smoke from a lit cigarette, a burning cigarette, contains about 4 parts per million, ppm, of carbon monoxide. That means for every million molecules of smoke, 4 of those molecules is carbon monoxide. This translates to a pack-a-day smoker. A pack, by the way, is 20 cigarettes. Lowering their oxygen saturation by up to 10%. They go from 100% saturation at sea level to 90% saturation at sea level by smoking a pack a day. If you went from 100% saturation to 90% saturation acutely, you'd be dying. We'd be like drastically worried about your health. Like, we'd be worried that you had some kind of like embolism to your lung and that part of your lung wasn't working. Like, you'd be dying, actively in pain, gasping for breath. But pack-a-day smokers walk around at 90 or 92. That's not good enough. That's not good. And so the acute effect is that they'll have lower energy, they'll be short of breath, and they'll be tired because they have low oxygen saturation. The low energy comes from a decreased level of oxygen. You need oxygen to make ATP through aerobic respiration. Shortness of breath, because they have 90% oxygen saturation. They're not getting enough oxygen to their brain. They're tired because they're not saturated. They're not making enough ATP. All of their tissues are not perfused well enough by this 90% saturation. So that's where these symptoms come from acutely. Over the chronic, if you have this for a long enough time, if you have this for a long enough period of time, you will directly increase the risk of atherosclerotic disease by damaging the endothelial lining of the arterial walls. The endothelium, the tunica intima. Direct damage to the tunica intima results in an atheroma or an atherosclerotic plaque formation, a scar tissue formation. So when you damage this vessel lining, when you go from a smooth vessel to a rough vessel, the blood that was flowing through nice and smoothly is now not flowing through so smoothly anymore. And when that blood flows through less smoothly, it hits the wall and bounces. And when the blood hits the wall and bounces, it makes the damage worse. And it increases the risk of fatty deposition, further decreasing blood flow, making that thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker until nothing gets out, until there is no more flow. So atherosclerotic disease leads to decreased flow of blood through the vessels, which leads to an increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and peripheral artery disease, which is a leading cause of limb amputation. If there is no blood flow to a limb, that tissue can die. And if the tissue dies, you must cut it off before bacteria begin to eat it and release toxins into what little blood flow you have remaining, and those toxins kill you, the rest of your healthy body. So you must cut off that which does not have blood flow. So let's talk about the acute effects of nicotine now. Nicotine, within seconds of entering the alveolus, is already through the alveolar wall, through the endothelial wall, to the heart, and into the brain, because the blood is pumping that fast. Within seconds, it's in the brain. And it acts directly as a central nervous system stimulant. It directly stimulates the central nervous system, causing the autonomic nervous system to narrow the arterioles, decreasing the blood supply to the distal extremities, the hands and the feet, and releasing epinephrine. I call it epinephrine, Cambridge calls it adrenaline. They're the same thing. Adrenaline is just trademarked. You can't call it adrenaline in the US without paying somebody. So it releases epinephrine from the adrenal glands, which results in an increased blood pressure and an increased heart rate. An increased blood pressure will increase the risk of acutely damaging the vessel walls, and an increased heart rate will increase myocardial oxygen demand. Myocardial, heart muscle, oxygen demand. The heart muscle needs oxygen badly. So, nicotine will also increase the risk of blood clot formation by increasing platelet aggregation. The platelets get sticky, and they stick together. And when platelets stick together, they form clots. And clots inside a blood vessel stop the flow of the blood vessel. That's bad. Increased low-density lipoprotein, LDL, cholesterol. LDL is the bad cholesterol. LDL is the kind that is associated with increased risk of heart disease. Nicotine directly increases LDL cholesterol levels. So don't believe the tobacco companies' ads that say, oh, nicotine's just the stuff that's addictive. It doesn't have any negative health effects. Yes, it does. Yes, it absolutely does. The vapor cigarettes have nicotine. That has health effects. Nicotine by itself has health effects. Don't believe for a second that those vapor things don't have health effects, because they do. They will, because nicotine has health effects. Nicotine definitely has health effects by itself. Chronic exposure to nicotine. Because of the combination of an increased low-density lipoprotein cholesterol due to the direct nicotine effects and arterial wall damage resulting from increased blood pressure due to autonomic upregulation, there is an increased risk of atherosclerosis plaque formation and subsequent poor cardiovascular outcomes. Because of the combination of the decreased blood supply to the distal extremities, because of that narrowed arterioles from the autonomic nervous system upregulation, and the increased risk of forming blood clots by increasing platelet aggregation due to the direct effects of nicotine, and the increased risk of atherosclerosis disease from LDL cholesterol and blood pressure, chronic nicotine exposure will dramatically increase the risk of ischemic infarction, tissue death due to a lack of oxygen, and medically necessary limb amputation. Also increased risk of cardiovascular outcome, bad cardiovascular outcomes, heart attack and stroke. Now I want to discuss why nicotine is addictive. This is possibly not tested by Cambridge. This is a little bit extra. So nicotine is structurally similar to nicotinamide neurotransmitters. They stimulate the release of dopamine in your brain, and dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. So they directly stimulate the reward centers of your brain. So your brain is hardwired to associate nicotine and compounds that are shaped like it with good things with positive pleasure. And that results in addiction. Nicotine instantly makes you feel good. It makes you happy. It makes you feel like you're winning. And in people, okay, so that's why nicotine is addictive, because it works directly on your brain. And it makes it very difficult to get people off of nicotine addiction. It's a psychological and a physiological addiction because they feel that need. They have built those pathways that associate it with pleasure. It's a psychological addiction as well as a physical need for that pleasure. So, people who have not smoked for very long, they'll just reverse the chemical insults. The carbon monoxide decreasing the oxygen supply, that'll get better. Eventually the carbon monoxide will go away as they keep breathing. The nicotine stuff, the nicotine will go away. And their heart will get back to normal, their blood pressure will get back to normal, everything will get back to normal. But if it happens for long enough, they will build up damage over time to the point where once you get to atherosclerosis disease, that's permanent. That cannot be undone. You cannot undo that. You can't hit Control Z on the last 20 years of smoking. Stopping will help, but you can't undo some of that damage. So if both of those chemical insults, they are each acting individually, each one causes its own set of problems, but both together is especially problematic because carbon monoxide decreases the supply and nicotine increases the demand. So if you don't have the supply to meet the demand, your heart will quit. Your heart is demanding oxygen. Carbon monoxide is preventing your hemoglobin from supplying that oxygen. If your heart quits, you die. So that's what happens with a supply shortage in the human body. It's bad in the economy, it's even worse in biology. So the top part is Cambridge exam relevant. The bottom part is less Cambridge exam relevant, but also helpful. Because this part is also true. Nicotine through sympathetic stimulation increases coronary vasoconstriction. Remember your definition of vasoconstriction. The vessel constricts, decreases in diameter. This decreases myocardial oxygen supply. Sympathetic stimulation also increases heart rate and increases blood pressure, which increases myocardial oxygen demand. Nicotine by itself is increasing demand and decreasing supply. Problems. Carbon monoxide decreases oxygen availability, which decreases myocardial oxygen supply. Double problems, triple problems. This platelet activation here, which could also result from nicotine, quadruple problems. I won't go over the rest of this in this review in these review series. Now, I've talked about atherosclerotic disease, but I can't draw nearly this well. So this is atherosclerosis disease. This is actually just from a diagram showing someone with atherosclerosis disease from high cholesterol. This is the first decade to the 4th decade, the 40th year of life. Yeah, shorten that time scale with smoking. Because you are raising the LDL cholesterol and adding nicotine as a factor and adding carbon monoxide as a factor. That's 3 hits that all cause atherosclerotic disease. So you are shortening this. you are making this progression much faster. So you progress from a normal vessel to foam cells, to a fatty streak, to an intermediate lesion. The thickness here, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker until you have a true atheroma with fibrous, and then a fibrous plaque. And then you can get a complicated rupture of some sort. So it can end in one of three ways. A critical stenosis, where the vessel has such a large plaque that it's too thin. The lumen is too small for blood to get through. And there is insufficient blood supply to the distal organ structure. And the organ beyond dies. Ischemic infarction, or ischemic failure. A superimposed thrombus. Because there is turbulent flow here and prothrombotic factors, a small clot can get stuck in this narrow opening. If there is a rupture of the plaque, that can induce thrombosis in and of itself. And you're already at a narrow opening, so it doesn't take a very large clot to completely close over this vessel. And you have no blood flow. So if this ruptures, then the lesion itself will cause that thrombus to form, and you close off the vessel entirely. Or that gets dislodged and goes somewhere very important. The brain. You can also have an aneurysm and rupture. An aneurysm is when the wall is weakened. This turbulent flow is causing problems even for the healthy vessel tissue. And that causes stress and strain on the healthy vessel tissue. And the thinner wall may not be able to take that shear stress, and it may tear. And then you'll bleed out through that vessel. And you will have a hemorrhagic infarction, where blood will not flow because it's leaking out. So there are bad ends all around. So that's the end of smoking. Now it's time to start infectious diseases.